Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Best Practices for Creating and Maintaining a Library of Data Collection Standards. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your question into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your question at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So I would like to quickly introduce the first speaker, Mr. Richard Young, VP Strategy at Veeva. Speaker, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trifine, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, Jen. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. It's a pleasure to have a chance to share the stage with you today. I am simply going to start with introducing you because you are the star of the show today, and we are going to give the vast majority of time to you. I think we'll do my introduction before I do my first slides. But Jen, with almost 20 years of clinical research experience, I think it's fair to say you are widely recognized as one of the industry's leading experts in data standards and have committed a large part of your career to building and implementing standards and making sure that your study teams understand how to implement and use those during all of your activities at Lilly. So we're excited to have you today. I want to also recognize that as part of your current role, you've been helping Lilly with their adoption of Veeva Vault CDMS, hence why we're together today, and particularly with leading the development of a library-driven approach to the adoption of Vault EDC. And we're incredibly grateful to have you here joining us today. So thank you again. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Richard Young, and I look after the overall strategy of Vault EDC and CDMS. I've been in data management around, well, I've been told to stop saying the exact number. Let's go with over 20 years, so I'll settle for that, and I'm delighted to have a chance to present to you all today. I will absolutely be the lesser part of the presentation today, but hope I will be able to add a little bit of commentary as we go. The topic for today's presentation, as the title says, is about best practices for creating a library of data collection standards. And we're going to take it further. It's not just about creating, we also want to talk about implementation and maintaining. And with that in mind, you'll be delighted to hear that our agenda for today is just that. It's about creating standards for collecting data. It's about implementing a library, and it's about maintaining that library and promoting its use as we progress. Now, before we hand over to Jen, let me perhaps set a little bit of scene and talk a little bit about how Veeva came to be in this particular activity and why it's important to us, and share some of those ideas before I ask Jen to really deliver the detail. First of all, I think it's obvious to all, but it's worth just reiterating. You know, the benefits of data standards, they should be clear to everyone, but let's document them for the purposes of this presentation. The first thing for me is relatively easy. It's about reducing cycle time. It's about finding efficiencies in the build process and making the whole process of data design, cleaning and programming more effective. How do we put that into perspective? Well, Veeva has this idea of a 4-week build. That's a goal in many organizations. But we're also competing against the backdrop, if you read the Tufts research, where build cycles are north of 15, 16 weeks. Not uncommon to have organizations in 20 weeks. This is just an obvious target for us to reduce that time. If we think about the ultimate goal of going from protocol to first patient, first visit really quickly, this has to be something we're really going to push on. So reducing that cycle time for me is an obvious target for us as data managers to really contribute. But speed isn't everything. Let's think about quality. How do we improve data entry quality? How do we also improve build quality? Well, by focusing the efforts of our teams on what matters, we hope we can really contribute to that. By being able to rely on standards and almost take that decision away from them, we use standards because they are just that, standards. Let's focus them on key decisions that they need to make and relieve them of decisions that they don't need to make. Doing that should hopefully drive up compliance, not just within your own organization, but think about your partners, think about your CROs, think about other data providers, where that level of compliance, the higher it is, the better your overall data flow will be. Think about what that compliance also means to your downstream partners, whether that's programming or biostatistics. The more we adhere to these standards, the better the overall end-to-end process will work. And of course, consistency. As your organizations grow, it's important that everyone understands those standards, they adhere to them, and they follow them. But I also want to put to you that maybe standards doesn't start and end just with eCRFs or page designs. Perhaps we should be looking further. And to look further, let's go beyond CRFs. Let's think about instructions for use. Let's think about creating frequently answered question guidelines so that our teams and our users and our consumers can fully understand. Think about completion guidelines. These are the usual things, perhaps. But what about going further? What about building test cases so they can move from one study to the next? What about having test results that can be transferred from one study to another so that we can truly agree and define what a standard is? And maybe we go even a step further, programming transformations, making sure that the standards we've adhered to on the far left with our CF standard is also driving real value and benefit all the way downstream with whoever's next in our data flow chain. If we do that, we can really start to identify and quantify the benefits of little or no change, because no change surely means we can reuse with very little effort. And that's when we start to realize the cost of change. Even one small item being changed will have a multiplying effect on everyone downstream. As such, if we have a call for action, and hopefully this is why you've joined us today, we're going to ask you to take the time to standardize not just those CRF standards, but all of the supporting documents that go with it. Now, a number of you will be in different stages in our audience of adoption. Some of you will be really thinking today about how do I get started. Perhaps you're at an organization that's even thinking about its first clinical trial. Perhaps you're an organization that's thinking about bringing in some of these activities for the first time. Perhaps you're an organization that just hasn't got around to really developing standards, and this is your first approach at that. Yeah, but what we hear a lot is it's hard to get started. And that's something we'll explore during this session. Our advice is really to start thinking about existing studies. Start to think about whether they're fit for purpose. You don't have to define a standard before you do anything. You can look at the assets you have. You can look at where you can reuse them. Look at where change is actually a requirement versus a nice to have, and make sure we use that early evidence we have to codify and document our decisions as we go. If we do that, we give ourselves a nice framework to both grow, but also support the use of those standards. A big one I hear about is lack of ownership, engagement, or investment. Well, as hopefully Jen is going to share with you, that's key, because that is what she does, and she makes sure that the whole Lilly organization stick to. The way you do that is by tracking utilization, flag where things are different, and make sure it's actually hard to change from standards. That's where true ownership and executive sponsorship comes in. Proliferation of standards is a key one. I said make it hard. How about really hard? No, you can't change. This is what we do, and the values of doing it this way are incredibly important and valued incredibly highly. So get used to saying no. We don't change just because somebody fancies doing something different. Let's make sure this is a true standard, it's adhered to across the business, and that nobody just wants to change just because their study's different. Something we hear a lot. Overstuffed standards. I like this phrase a lot, because a lot of time what we hear about is people trying to perhaps accommodate for the every possible scenario standard, where actually you've got so many things in there, it almost becomes impractical because no one's ever going to use that whole standard. So actually, it's about creating and finding the right balance between what is a standard and is it fit for purpose, but avoiding the temptation to just put everything into a page. And finally, out of date. These are the 5 things I would flag. How many of us have data standards that we haven't reviewed in multiple years? How often should we be reviewing them? Are there new techniques, new tactics, new clinical standards that we should be thinking about adhering to? Now, these are the 5 things that I spend a lot of time talking to prospective customers and other technical companies about. And I think running through these, I hear some interesting threads that I'll share. One of which is here the scenario where a company will tell me, we have incredible standards, we have 95% adherence to them. You ask, okay, well, what's your average time for database design? And maybe it's still in that 18 to 20 week range. But if you've got such great standards, how does it take so long? But actually, as you drill in, you realize they don't just have a standard, they have hundreds of standards. And actually, potentially they've lost sight of what a standard and a true standard should really be. The reality is they have so many standards that things are copied in, from one study to the next almost randomly, in fact, defeating the entire purpose for standard. So understanding your goals within standardization, I think, is pretty important. I'd also share a little success story. And this is one from a company in the top 100 pharma companies. And one of the things they've said to me is, as they move into new therapeutic areas, a form has to be used 3 times without being amended before it can be called a standard. It might be reused, but before that extra investment of standardization comes in, it has to be reused multiple times. Simple rules that came into those early decisions that I think have really paid off dividend, and paid off dividend heavily in subsequent conversations. Now, some principles I think we will all agree on as well, but something just to think about. The first is to align with industry standards where they exist. I think everyone has a keen eye on CDASH. We also will look at how we interpret CDASH and how we want to make it work for our studies. Does CDASH in fact define all of the forms and standards we would need for our therapeutic studies? Let's make sure we can follow the standards where possible, but also stick true to the ideology behind those standards where we need to invent something new. Keep the end in mind. So where we can use SDTM labels, let's think about that. Let's not create other labels that we know we're going to have to change. Let's try and be consistent and reduce the workload later. And finally, something I think is really important is really think about site and patient centricity. Remember, the sites are often the users that we're doing most of this work for from a form presentation perspective. We're thinking about how patients and sites can enter data most effectively. We're also thinking about what it means downstream, hence the focus on SDTM, hence the focus on using the standards to make sure we have a proper process from collection through to reporting. But I think by looking at these 3 principles and weighing them equally, you can really start to think about what a good standards methodology can be. To drill into a couple of those principles a little bit further, the downsides of unnecessary data, that overstuffing of standards, it's kind of counterproductive, because now we have a standard that has the items that perhaps we're going to move around or delete, and it opens the door to creating new standards. It opens the door for things to be changed. It also leads to mistakes. And that's why I think one of the things we really want to focus on is the downsides of unnecessary data. It's not just the inconvenience during the process of building, it's the downstream cost of potentially collecting data that we shouldn't be collecting, or that we don't need to collect, or we have no plan to use. It's also the risk of failing to collect something that actually is really critical. So let's think about capturing, owning what's required to support study objectives. If you're in the audience today and you're looking for guidance on how to get started, let's also think about that for a second. I mentioned earlier about codifying and documents decisions as you go. A good starting point from our experience is to think about the really common standards, the ones you're likely to use in every single study. And we think of things such as demography, inclusion, exclusion, informed consent, and the likes. These are things you're going to use in every single study. I would hope there's consistency in a lot of these areas as you look from one study to the next. But certainly, even if you look at a few studies that are different, you're going to start to see common elements. You can take advice from external groups like CDASH and actually think about how you pull those through. But look at those standards, review them, and document the commitments you make, because they will be important when you start to think about training. Now, maybe it's worth sharing an example of that. And indeed, let's think about that. So this is an example we've taken from one of our other customers, just to kind of share in a neutral way. It's very much about looking at the variables on the CRF page, identifying if they're related to a code list or how you wish to collect the data, so the type and the length. Maybe there's a SAS variable name, but then also bringing in introductions, i.e. when you can delete this page, when it must absolutely be required, what is the position, and so on the page. You might also link it to EDC settings, such as anything default. So can this date be partial? Does it have to be completed in full? Is it a required item or not required? Relatively simple decisions, but worth documenting because it avoids downstream conversations. But again, I wanted to suggest you might take it a little bit further. Why stop just with the actual clinical data definitions? Why not think about how you can use metadata as part of that standard? As we move more and more into a big data world, the use of metadata to drive downstream transformations becomes more and more relevant, more and more exciting. Maybe start with some basics, thinking about the name of your form, the release date of that form, or the version. So as you move through studies, and as you think about submission packages, you can look and pre-identify any differences as you've built out the portfolio of studies. But collecting this information early on and managing it is really important. Now, final couple of slides before we get to the highlight. I mentioned an FAQ, so maybe it's worth sharing an example of that. The type of thing you would use here. And if we focus in fact, on one of them, let's just focus on units for a second. We talk in this FAQ about, do we have a company standard unit of measurement? Should we be focused on a particular thing like Celsius? Well, here's where you can put some instructions, because it may not be an absolute answer. This may vary geographically, but you can absolutely include instructions that if it's US-based sites, these are the standard units. If it's global, alternative units can be used. You can perhaps introduce the concept of conversion factors across those units as well, things that can be stored here and reused many times. Now, this has been a whistle-stop tour, because really I want to just set Jen up to talk about delivery. And with that in mind, I'm just going to summarize. The first three I hope we've covered. I think it's important to really have accessible and organized templates. I think it's important to enforce the use of those and to have good governance around them. But I want to take one last thing, if I was going to ask you to consider one last thing from me, is to think about how you use those standards to train your new hires. Think about how you train your entire organization, all stakeholders and teams, to be aware of the standards, to understand the importance of them. Because whether they're writing a protocol, executing, or reporting it, everyone understanding the standards means they can really participate and they can feel the benefits of them. That makes your life a lot easier. And remember, who's the ultimate beneficiary? Well, it's everyone from the patients to the sites, all the way through to statistical reporting. And the more you can adhere to standards, the better everyone's life is going to be. Now, you'll be glad to hear, almost exactly on time, I am ready to hand over to Jen. So perhaps we can switch presentation and we can let her take you through the implementation and into the maintenance of libraries. And I'll let her take over from here.
Thank you, Richard, and for having me. As stated, I'm Jen Showalter. I have been working with standards for quite a long time, and so some of the things I'm going to talk about are from my learnings in working through this and why a library is so important to enable all of those benefits that were being discussed. So when getting started, this was our approach, and we've talked about standards and having standards being important. That strong foundation is critical, and it has been critical to our success. So when getting started with that, we kind of looked at, what is really being used across studies to identify what types of forms we might want to include or any object to include in the library. We looked across phases, maybe therapeutic areas, efficacy measures. You can think of what makes sense for you, but that was our first line of approach. Then we started collaborating with our stakeholders end to end on the library content. And when I say end to end, I mean, who are our end users ultimately, statisticians, medical, but also then from site experience, what had been their experience, what would make it easier for them to understand our content and enter data. But also, if we have any systems that we integrated with, we really thought about, what that was needed and having stakeholders on board. And Richard just talked about training, thinking about training. This is already then some form of change agent within your organization, or a team of change agents that can really help with adoption once you are ready to deploy and put your library in use. Providing governance and guidance around ensuring the flexibility to meet those study needs is really important to think about out of the gate. And then, you know, share learnings through historic design implementation efforts where things have not worked as well in the past. You can learn from that and start off fresh with your library. So probably some of you are sitting out there and you've already worked with libraries and other EDC tools. Those capabilities exist. But some of these things I'm going to point out again are not just if you have a legacy library, but something if you're starting from scratch for the very first time. Really think about building new forms rather than replicating old practices that maybe weren't working, and you know what those pain points may have been for you. So take the time to identify those improvements, but also leverage the capabilities that are available in the tool today. So some things that we took advantage of are progressive displays or date time controls, some of the system functionality for form linking and things like that. Those are things that are advantages of redesigning our forms and really leveraging those capabilities. And then prioritize forms that are most frequently used to begin development. And Richard kind of talked on where you might get started. This was exactly what we did. We looked across our portfolio and said, everybody's using these 10 forms. Let's start here so that we can get started somewhere. And we didn't try to take it all on at one time. One thing about working in Vault EDC when you're creating a library, create a single collection. This will help you leverage some things I'm going to talk about when you are maintaining a library. This was all built on the foundation that we're managing one big library, and then we're kind of dividing it out using objects, and I'll talk through that. You can label it such that it makes sense. And then one key thing I want to note about creating a library in Vault EDC, and I'll talk about why, is start in the library. Don't start if you already have studies in Vault EDC. Don't copy those studies in to your library, but really start from scratch. This might feel like initially a little bit of rework. However, there is a really important library key that gets assigned to each of those objects, and it will help with tracking the usage of those objects, as well as where you're varying study to study, which will inform you of things that need to be maintained downstream and how you're doing with your library use. And then lastly, one thing to really think about is making sure that when you're developing your library, you're actually using the rigor that you use when you're developing an individual study. Look at those processes and try to reuse them as much as possible. That will benefit you from redoing the work as you get down into your study when a library is used. We talked about cycle times and reduction and things like that. That's where this really comes into play. So because of that and what I just talked about, it's good to develop a process, and we have documented a process that provides an overview of what's in our library, how we developed our library, the expectation for using that library, what we do to maintain that library, and I'll go through each of those in a little more detail. And then not only does it help with, having something documented that can be followed consistently, this can be used as a reference at the study level. I didn't retest something, why not? Because I had developed it and followed the process within my library itself. Okay, I'm going to start to dig into a little bit of some of those components that we're leveraging within the Vault EDC library itself, and what we have built out formally. We have events and event groups, which we've leveraged both. We've leveraged not just building events for visits, but actually event groups to group those visits that might make sense for TA1 versus TA2. We have our forms, standard forms that should be used, and then they contain the item groups and items. Our item groups are really being managed for what we feel should standardly always be grouped together. Obviously, those individual items, such as questions that go in each, on each form, can be managed independently and should be, for us, we really looked at that as to we might want to do a different variation of the form in the future. So let's go ahead and put the investment in managing the items as well. Code lists, I'm going to take a minute to kind of talk about our approach here. And you'll see later on, I talk about variations and talking about managing, kind of at the high level and not getting too many variations in your library. Code list is one way we've really leveraged that. So an example I have is maybe therapeutic area 1 needs 5 reasons that apply to them for treatment disposition and collecting on a disposition form, or study intervention disposition, if you will. Therapeutic area B, maybe they needed some of those 5 reasons, but they need 2 more. And so we are maintaining 2 sets of code lists, but therefore we only have to maintain 1 form within the library, and it's an easy changing which code list is referenced. And we then use that through allowable changes, which I'll touch on in just a second to show our study designers how they should make those updates. We have several user-defined rules that we have built in the library. Some of those are add rules, which you might know as dynamic rules. They are already written to open different forms or visits within our library, and those can be used at the study level. We have our data verification rules. Those are both within form and cross-form. Set value rules, if those are needed. Subject status rules. Lilly integrates with the Vault Clinical CTMS, so subject status rules are critical for us, and that's something we want to ensure is done consistently. So we've built that into the library. And then lastly, another example is email rules. If we have, for example, we want to send an email every time an SAE is entered into the form or is updated. That's something that we've standardly set up as an email rule, and therefore we're managing email groups. We have standard email addresses that are used to send those alerts, and so we're managing those at the library level so that they don't have to be managed study by study. And then lastly, I mentioned form links in some new functionality that we're leveraging. That's something we actually are building in our library today to start to leverage so that we're consistently linking forms together. An example is adverse events to disposition. If a subject is dispositioning due to an adverse event, they need to link to that adverse event that has been entered, and that form link setup has been built into our library so that our study designers are consistently using that. Now, we have components outside of Vault EDC as well that we're managing as part of our holistic library. Richard and I have both mentioned how it's important to give guidance on what changes could be made. Your standard needs to be pretty stringent, but there should be things that you allow some flexibility from a scientific perspective, or things you know will always need to change. Those types of things, I kind of give an example from a disposition perspective. TA1 needs this code list, TA2 needs this code list. We've leveraged our allowable changes for that. We are managing our data check specification, or what we refer to as a data check specification. It is holistic of both rules or verification that is being done inside of Veeva EDC or Vault EDC. It is also including those things that may need to be verified outside of Vault EDC using other tools, such that they might be a manual or using some kind of report. Lastly, we are managing form instructions or completion guidelines as well. All of that then contains instructions to our study designers on updates they need to be making at the study level based on whatever those changes they made at the study level were. So for example, if we said an allowable change was to remove an item from a form, we have provided instructions in the completion guidelines to say, don't forget to remove this item if your study needed to. So speaking of that, there is a very important part about managing documentation that comes along with this. It's important that they stay aligned, is the thing I want to get across here. Your studio or Vault EDC Studio library version should stay aligned to your non-studio components. You have leveraged, maybe you're making updates in your library and a study has already pulled that in that library that was published into their study, they need to know all those other components to pull in, the completion guidelines, the data check specification. So we use a versioning method to do that. Documentation should be accessible to those stakeholders. Part of why is because of the impact assessment I'm going to talk about, but it helps them if they're getting questions. They're part of your change agent network that, you know, people are wanting to use the library and they want to understand decisions that were made. If that documentation is not accessible, it becomes a barrier to really the success of your library. It should also be user-friendly. That's something that we learned over time, that it's really important that it's accessible, user-friendly. People will then use it. The last thing I want to say about impact assessments here, I mentioned it, but in order to enable those, I'll talk more about a couple things we do to look at impact assessments. But if you can't get to the content in a single location and really track what is in the library and who owns it, and what I mean by that is depending on how your governance structure is set up, if it's owned by TA1 or if it's owned by all TAs, who needs to be brought in for those impact assessments with your stakeholders, that's something that you really want to have a process for. And we have evolved this over time such that it becomes easier to leverage the documentation that's available within the system. This I won't touch on too much. Richard also kind of gave some examples, but these are real life examples of what we have in our library, where we started, adverse events, medical history, demographics, some of the things we went after first to make sure that we got something out there that everybody could use. And then we have evolved over time to really expand that to what might make sense. So for example, prior therapies have been added for TA1 versus TA2. And exposure is another good example of what we've really tried to tackle based on maybe the modality for your study intervention, whether it is daily also or maybe once a week kind of exposure, and what that standard looks like for us has dictated what goes into the library. Okay, so I talked to just now, you saw that there were variations, and I also gave the example of dispositioning looking different for one study versus the other. Though, if you have a lot of variation and you have, I think Richard called it overstuffed your standards, you have a lot of that built in, it's going to be hard to maintain your library. We've learned the hard way. And it's also something that you just really want to consider how to minimize from a resourcing perspective, a use. If teams find it too hard to use or it's not being effectively used in the studies, they'll stop. And then your library kind of doesn't get that benefit that you want out of it. So we've looked at this master kind of idea where we're managing things at a master level, and we're using guidance to tell our study designers what to do, which has really been beneficial for us to reduce that overhead and burden from maintaining within the library, but then really still be able to allow for that flexibility where it's needed. So when using the library, we set expectations that you should always start, our study designers all start with the library every single time. And then we have that guidance that says, you know, these are the things that you may be able to change without talking to stakeholders or governance. That, you know, we do not set the expectation that 100% of our library is going to be used as is. However, there is some tough love for us around governance about, you know, we have a guide on we expect to use this much of our library, and we've looked at over time how are we doing, and I'll show you kind of, or I'll talk through how we do that. But that's what I mean by setting a goal. We found what made sense for us, and our goal is not 100%. And then when there's inevitably going to be times where a study may need to go outside of that. Science changes. We're in the business of research. So have a process to involve those stakeholders, and it should be the same stakeholders that were really involved in the initial development of the library. They're your change agents. They really understand the impact end-to-end of a change and can really help inform. Now, you might be thinking that seems a bit overkill, or how are you getting all of those changes reviewed in the time frame that each study might need it? We have a tiered or layered type of governance process at Lilly that really facilitates a quick review of these changes as it goes through the process, and we really don't slow down study development from that perspective. But we're still really thinking through whether or not a change should be allowed, and if so, how best to implement that change. So there's a tool that we rely on heavily to support the use of our library at the study level, and that's the System Generated Difference Report from Vault EDC. It not only tells us the details of where we're diverging from our library, but essentially it does a compare of the study objects versus the library objects, gives us the differences. We can use that to inform us, did we intend to make that change? Was that something that we got the right approvals for, or networked through our stakeholders? And then also it guides us to testing. We can take a risk-based approach to our testing to say, that rule didn't change, we don't need to retest that rule, or that object didn't change, whatever that object may be, we don't need to do a re-review of that object, or like I said, retest that object. We have leveraged this heavily to help reduce our cycle times when using our library at the study level. So I'm going to go a little bit into our experience, and really particularly around maintenance. So I've mentioned that a couple of times. It cannot be, a big overhead for maintaining the library, but you will need to maintain that library. There will be changes. So first, before I jump into, how we maintain, I've mentioned several times about governance and referred to governance. And we have a governance process, like I said. We involve appropriate stakeholders in the initial development, and then we leverage those stakeholders for those allowable changes. We track and monitor change requests overall so that we can really inform what our updates to the library should be, and you'll see me or hear me talk about that. And because of all of those three boxes I just walked through, we have developed a maintenance process, and again, I'll walk you through what that looks like. So a couple things before I get into the process itself. Changes can come from multiple areas. So again, I'm going to talk through how we track all of that, but a change can come from the external environment as well as internal to us. A change can come from a regulatory initiative or things that we need to change from a collection across the board for any clinical research. It can come from industry like C- or some SCDM version that changes, how we need to collect data. But they also can come from, system enhancements. Veeva releases 3 times a year some of those new functionality or capabilities we want to get into our library. And then lastly, they can come from existing components that are being used in real life in studies, and they inform us of changes that we need to be making to the library. So that kind of summarizes some of those internal and external sources. With those sources that I mentioned, we have a process. I'm going to start talking though that I said at the beginning, our standard is our foundation, and that standard, it can be a data element standard, it can be, like I said, SCDM or study data tabulation model standard. If there are updates to those standards that may impact our library, there is a review of those on a regular basis. You might feel like that sounds like a manual process. We have developed some automation tools to really compare when an update is made in our standard. It always starts in our standard, as I said, and then would get updated in our library. There's a regular review and then an assessment impact within our company to look at what might need to be changed. From there, we assess if a change is an urgent change. Maybe you need an off-cycle maintenance when necessary, but most of the time our change is defaulted to our next maintenance cycle, whether that be in 2 months or 4 months. whatever that cycle is for us, it defaults to. We really try to avoid off-cycle maintenances, and so one way that we've learned to do that is to ask that our study designers, and we have a process for our study designers looking at what urgent changes they may need to make in their individual studies themselves, so that we can avoid doing a rush update to the library. If there are technical or system changes that occur, we also are evaluating that and have a process for those to be submitted to us. So our study designers may have things that they want to report back as system updates or technical changes that we need to make, as well as those, for example, in our data management team that may be reporting back to us to say, hey, it would help, the site's having trouble entering data in this form every time. Maybe we should think about doing this differently. All of those that come into us are tracked and evaluated using our request system. So again, I talked about we might need to make immediate studies, changes for studies in development. That is all tracked and evaluated in a request system I'm going to show you an example of. And our study designers can then export that information when they're starting to build a study, and it kind of serves as a requirement for them as to what they might need to update after they copy in from the library. From there, though, this is also used, our request system also is used as our requirement for the next maintenance itself. Again, we can export, and there we have all the list of changes that need to be made during that maintenance cycle. And then our library team can take that and execute against that in updating and maintaining the library. That is something that has been really important for our success in minimizing the effort over time between maintenance cycles as to what may need to be updated. It also allows multiple end users to inform us of what changes may need to be made to the library without us having to manage it through just a few individuals themselves. This is just an example of what our change log or change request system looks like when that is exported. So we have a mechanism to understand by components what object may need to change, what that change is that's being requested. We then manage what comments. So if it's evaluated and we're not going to make that change, we'll document the why. I think Richard touched on this. It's important to help people understand why we didn't want to make that change at this time. It also serves for us that, as the standards or library team to say, you know, maybe we need to reevaluate down the road because things have evolved in how we're using that object itself. And then lastly, we have a status. So things come in obviously listed as new. That helps filter down for our library and standards team who are part of this evaluation to see these are the 5 things I need to look at this week, versus informing our study designers to say this is something you need to implement in your study until it's in the library. And then lastly, it might have a status of save until next maintenance or implement in next maintenance, so that we can pull those out pretty quickly as well. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about how we maintain the library itself, but there is a tool that is system generated out of Vault EDC called the library report that really helps us look at this, not only from a compliance perspective, how are we doing, but also to inform us of things that we may need to be adjusting to help make sure that our library stays current and relevant over time. It gives us visibility into the library usage. It uses that library key. And so that's why I was iterating how important it is to start from scratch in the library. It really tells you what was pulled from the library and then used and copied down into a study. It will tell you if that item was changed. It will tell you if a new item was created and originated in a study. So that helps inform us of, again, how are we doing? How many times are people changing elements or objects? It also helps inform if things are being created new, maybe we need to evaluate adding something into the library. And so those are some of those maintenance considerations I have here on the slide around thinking and how we use this. And then the last thing I'll say that we've really leverage the library report for our, we have metrics, we set goals to say a library should be used at 80%, for example, in a study, and not changed or updated. That will give us visibility into, are we doing well at the study level? What do we need to do to change? Or are we allowing too many changes at the study level, and we need to kind of look at what our guidance is and adjust it from there. So we leverage this quite heavily right now, and we have a dashboard that's really helping us have a one-time look each month as to how we're doing in our studies. Before I close us out today, I do want to touch on resources. That's something I get questions about a lot. And so I wanted to kind of give you insight into what we do here. We have a subset of our study designers that are they're not dedicated, they are designated, I should say, to support our library. There are 5 of them, and one of them is designated as the lead librarian, who is responsible for those discussions with stakeholders, feeds into our standards governance process, maintains change requests, meaning if they need to be implemented at the study level, et cetera, and then manages overall those communications and trainings of our study designers as a whole to ensure that they understand the library itself. But I do want to reiterate that this is a subset. That team also, of those 5 or so individuals, they are also assigned other study work. They're not dedicated to the library, but this allows us a model to support our library maintenance and develop new development, while also not then needing a dedicated team to do that. So I'm going to wrap us up and close today with a couple of realized benefits of this consistency and reuse that we have found from using the library. And you'll notice that many of them line up with initially what Richard started with in the benefits that we should realize. It has allowed our study teams to really focus on scientifically unique aspects rather than the routine. We don't need to discuss adverse event for every study. It has improved our site experience. They're seeing consistency. They see the same forms every time to collect certain data, and so then they understand what to do and how to enter the data into those forms. It has yield downstream efficiencies for us in delivery and integration, not just within our data management team, but also for our colleagues, like I said, such as medical when they're performing review, or our statisticians when they're creating SDTM or analysis data sets. It has supported automation and will continue to support automation throughout. It has reduced our study build cycle times and will continue to reduce. This is one of our main levers to really reduce those cycle times. Minimizes rework. We don't spend time creating and reviewing documentation if it's not changing. I mentioned we maintain all of that documentation in our library as a starting point. That really has reduced our time spent on creating those documents. And then lastly, it has improved our data quality, again, because of that consistency and reuse. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and I will turn it back over for questions.
Well, first of all, Jen, thank you very much. Incredible presentation. I had the luxury of seeing the slides before, and I've still written a load of notes. But before I go to the first question, can I just let the audience know, we have about 12 minutes. I know there's a delay in questions coming through, but they're all being copied through at the moment. So please do get your questions in just to make sure we can try and get them in. But maybe I can start, Jen. As we were preparing, one of the moderators, Tim, asked us if we could perhaps comment a little bit specifically on downstream benefits, thinking about statistics and SDTM. Would you mind just addressing that question for me?
Yeah, so the question, came in absolutely of how are we receiving those benefits downstream with our customers for SCDM, and how we do that is we really have looked at our process to standardize not only within Vault EDC and what we can do for what study designers use, but also how we leverage that to standardize what our extract data structures look like, to feed into our SCDM colleagues, so our statisticians. And one way we do that is to leverage the study design specification and ensure we have standard mapping set up for transformations. And then we have built standard code that we're leveraging every time to build those data sets that we deliver to our colleagues. Not only that, we've gone to the step of annotating our library to SDTM, not just putting it out there with the elements or the annotations to VaultTDC, but we've annotated to SDTM so they have something that they can pull down and use in their studies for specifications.
Perfect, thank you. Well, we'll see if there's follow-up questions then, but thank you for addressing that first.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to try and do these a little bit. There's some quick ones and some slightly longer ones, so let me try and mix and match. The first one is, how long did it take you to establish the library with its governance, with the governance that you have today?
How long? Oh, this has been a multi-year effort. We did have our standards governance process in place initially. And so adding the library into that was about a year where we kind of thought through, what do we want to put in the library? Who needs to be involved? We have a very strong partnership with our standards team overall. And then we didn't want to add additional layers of governance from a library perspective because we feel this is one component of our overall standard structure. So we just kind of added into that. But overall, like I said, it's a multi-year development, but the library itself was around a year that we from start to fully developed and having a process in place.
And then the ongoing commitment and the governance and the new standards.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, thank you. I hope that answered that question. There are many more coming in. Okay, there's obviously a lag. Right, let's even do this one. What was your approach when you started using Veeva EDC? Did you start implementing your library first, or did you just get going and then implement the library from there?
Good question. And for Lilly, we absolutely started building studies first. We wanted to understand the technology. We wanted to understand what we could leverage. And then we put together the effort to put a library in place. We always knew the library was something we wanted to do, but like I said, we wanted to get some experience in the system and the tool itself first before we went into developing the library.
Perfect, good. Thank you. Hopefully a quick one for you. How often are the maintenance cycles you mentioned?
Yeah, very quick. We do quarterly. That's because of the amount of studies that are going through and also the amount of change that we're seeing from our data standards. But that doesn't always make sense for everyone, but for us, it's quarterly is absolutely necessary.
Perfect. Now I'm going to try and paraphrase in each of time. There's a number of questions on the library key and a few questions about how to retrospectively use it and so on. But maybe I can just ask you, could you summarize a little bit more again about what the library key is, how you use it, and what it allows you to do, just for the audience?
Sure. So the library key, it's essentially a unique identifier that gets assigned to every object. And that identifier stays with that object through the life of its lineage. So as you copy it into a study, it stays with that object itself that originated in the library. Now, how we use that is we pull down the library report that I mentioned that's available out of Studio, and we look at the lineage of that, meaning we look at where it's been copied, how many studies it's been copied into, and then if it has been updated from a library object perspective. Because that unique identifier stays with the library object, that enables us to track it through that usage and really help us understand how we're doing, like I said, or updates we may need to make in the future to the library. So that, in short, is really what we're doing with it.
Perfect, great. And that's really, I'll just add, for me, that's important because that metadata-driven journey, and then you've got extra layers of reporting that we can take advantage of. And hopefully, when we get really into SDTM and automation on other layers, I'm hoping that'll be reused as well. So thank you for that. Maybe I could ask you to comment a little bit on the risk-based approach. Just again, there's questions here. Could you just comment a little bit on what that means to you and how you defined it? And are there any concerns you had when you first started entertaining risk-based approach to testing?
Sure. So I would say, you know, as data managers, as people working in this space, we really risk-based. We think about, we need to test everything. We need to look at everything. We need to make sure that it's all working as intended before we want our system to be perfect when we put it out there to start collecting data. However, you know, one of the things that we have to be comfortable with first was, is this difference report really telling us what has changed? Can we really count on this really telling us what has changed? Absolutely, we can. And because that's available, for us, the risk-based approach is, you know, it sounds like we're taking a risk approach, but we're really not, because we're confident that we've tested, and this is where I'll go and say, again, it's important to have a process for developing and testing your library and storing that documentation. Store your test scripts. Store the outcomes of your test results at the library level. That then mitigates all of your risk you might have from later on looking back at it from an inspection perspective. You can show that you went through the right process at the library level and then use the difference report to show that there were no changes, so no need to retest that object or that rule. That's really been success for us in cycle time reduction.
Perfect. So if anyone has an aversion to the use of the word risk, perhaps we can rephrase it for them, and it's more strategic testing rather than risk-based.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that has evolved in our process is to develop a strategy document around testing initially in each study because of this.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and get a couple more questions in for time, so maybe a quick one. Are you creating studies in parallel with protocol development, or do you still have some of a sequential process there?
Because of our success in reducing cycle times, we are able to really wait most of the time until protocol completion. There are some times where timelines dictate that we need to start earlier, but a lot of times when that's the case, we actually can just develop our forms and then pause and wait until the protocol is done and then finish the rest of the work, so we minimize rework if there are changes to the protocol after that.
Perfect. So you're off the critical path at this point, so you can wait until you're done.
Yes.
Perfect. I'm sure there's a few people in the audience who are glad to hear that. Good. One final thing, because there's a couple of questions that I might ask you to answer offline. They're a little bit about Veeva, and I don't want to ask them just yet, but I might ask you to address offline if that's okay. One thing you said about 3 releases a year. Could you just talk a little about how that impacts your library and the maintenance? And if I can be cheeky, if you could also maybe think about how does that combine with some of the external feedback you're getting as well? So what is that kind of 3 times a year process like for you when you look at what the new features are, what the external feedback is, and then how do you make updates?
Right. So starting with kind of the 3 releases a year, there are functionality that we watch for that. So for example, editable grids came out. That was something we really wanted to start to leverage. And so, you know, that was something we look for and we evaluate at each release. Is this something we want to make sure we get into our library? And then likely it will go into the next maintenance, but we're really evaluating those releases and understanding in the same fashion of a data standard change, do we want to put this into our library and start to leverage these features? Now, sometimes we can't leverage that feature right away because I mentioned the governance process. We need to get buy-in from our stakeholders to make that change. It really depends on how big of a change that is. However, we have not independently, I guess the point I want to make into your question about like also industry changes, we have not created an independent process for one type of change versus the other. They all go through this process. What I will say is, like I said, depending on the scope or the impact of the change, we have levels of governance, and depending, it may be able to be at this level of governance, the lowest level, that's just our implementation leads and our library team, versus does it need to go to our standard strategy? And that's really what we have to work through.
Perfect. Thank you. I know we're into the last few seconds, and so first of all, I want to make sure, once again, I say thank you very much for your time. There's a few questions here that we might ask you to take a look at offline as well. And for everyone who's asked a question we haven't got to, between Jen and I, we'll try and get you an answer as well. But maybe I can give the last word to you, Jen. Is there anything you would share above what you've already shared with the audience? Any closing words you would like to give them?
So if any of you out there know me, I'm passionate about this type of implementation. As you stated, Richard, I've been in standards for a long time, but this is really a key leverage to really getting the benefit out of Vault EDC overall. And it's something that, like I said, it's something that I really encourage all of you to put into as part of your strategy. It can be small or it can be huge. You don't have to have it all figured out when you start. You can learn along the way, and I'm always happy to give thoughts and things and learnings that we've had, but I really feel this is an important part of the strategy of using the tool overall.
Perfect. Thank you. We can summarize better. Thank you, Jen, again, and thank you to everyone who has joined us. We will try and end on time to preserve everyone's schedules, but thank you for everyone, and thank you to the SCDM for giving us this opportunity to present. And with that, I wish everyone a great day.
Bye.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Jen. For everyone who was asking about the presentation, the recording, it will be available within 48 hours on SCDM website and on YouTube channel. And also, if you would like to ask further questions, please contact us and we'll make sure the speakers get in touch with you. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Josephine.